Everyone knows the story. Blockbuster had a chance to buy Netflix for $50 million. They laughed the offer out of the room, and a decade later, they were bankrupt, while the company they turned away became worth over $100 billion. It's one of the most repeated cautionary tales in business history. Executives use it in keynote speeches. Professors use it in case studies. It's the go-to example of a company too arrogant to see the future coming. There's just one problem. That's not really why Blockbuster died. The real story is stranger, messier, and, in some ways, more damning, because it means the death of Blockbuster wasn't a single bad decision made by a room full of fools who couldn't see what was obvious in hindsight. It was a decade of debt, ownership changes, and one specific moment where a company that had actually built the thing that could have beaten Netflix chose to kill it themselves. By the end of this video, the villain of this story might not be the one you expect. In 1985, a man named David Cook had just been laid off from his job in the oil business. Looking for something new, he went to help a friend who ran a video rental store, and what he saw surprised him. Home video was still a young industry. VCRs had only become affordable for the average household a few years earlier, and video rental stores were popping up everywhere to meet the demand. But most of these stores were small operations. A single room, maybe a few hundred tapes, run out of a strip mall by someone who'd taken a chance on a new hobby-turned-business. Cook saw an opportunity to do it differently. In October of 1985, he and his wife opened the very first Blockbuster Video in Dallas, Texas. It didn't look like anything else on the market. Instead of a few dozen tapes behind a counter, Blockbuster stocked over 8,000 titles right out of the gate, displayed openly on bright, organized shelves that customers could browse themselves. There was no adult section, no dim lighting, no seedy reputation. It felt like a supermarket for movies, and it was designed to feel safe enough for the whole family to walk through together. Cook's background wasn't in entertainment. It was in software, and that turned out to be the store's secret weapon. While competitors were tracking inventory with index cards and handwritten ledgers, Blockbuster ran on barcodes and a computerized system that could track thousands of titles in real time. That single decision meant faster checkout, better stocking decisions, and the ability to scale in a way a mom-and-pop store simply couldn't. Roughly 70% of what people were renting in those early days wasn't the newest release. It was older titles, back-catalog movies that a small store with limited shelf space could never afford to stock. Blockbuster could. To understand why that mattered, it helps to picture what renting a movie actually looked like before Blockbuster showed up. Most video stores in the mid-1980s were small independent shops, often run out of a spare room or a converted retail space, stocking whatever the owner happened to be able to afford. Selection was thin, hours were inconsistent, and finding a specific title on a Friday night was often a matter of luck. Cook's insight wasn't just about scale, it was about turning movie rental into something predictable and reliable, a place where you could walk in on any given night and reasonably expect to find what you were looking for. That predictability, paired with a genuinely pleasant shopping experience, is what separated Blockbuster from the wave of small rental shops it would eventually replace. The first store was an immediate hit, and by 1986, Cook had expanded to 4 locations. But growth requires capital, and Cook ran into a wall. He'd planned to take the company public to raise the money he needed, but a critical newspaper story about his background in the oil industry spooked investors, and the IPO fell apart. Without that injection of cash, and with so much already spent chasing growth, Blockbuster posted a loss of over $3 million in 1986. The idea was proven. The execution was working. but the company needed someone with deep pockets to take it to the next level. If you're new here, this is the kind of story we dig into on this channel, the real history behind names everyone thinks they already understand. If you want more of that, the subscribe button is right there, and it helps more than you'd think. Now, back to the story. That someone with deep pockets was a man named H. Wayne Huizenga. Movies weren't really his passion. Building companies was. He'd already taken a small local garbage hauling business and, through an aggressive strategy of buying up smaller competitors across the country, turned it into a Fortune 500 company known today as Waste Management. He understood how to take a fragmented, unglamorous industry and consolidate it into a dominant national brand, and when he looked at the video rental business, he saw the exact same opportunity. In 1987, Huizenga and two former Waste Management colleagues invested just under $19 million into Blockbuster. In exchange, they took roughly a third of the company, along with something more important than the equity itself: voting control. Almost immediately, tension emerged between Huizenga and Cook. The two men had fundamentally different visions for how the business should grow. Cook, working with a smaller budget, had leaned toward franchising as a way to expand without needing huge amounts of capital. Huizenga wanted something different. He wanted to own the stores outright and build a brand as recognizable and consistent as McDonald's. Later that year, Cook sold his remaining stake and exited the company, walking away with around $12 million. The man who started Blockbuster was gone before it had even become the company most people remember. With Cook out of the picture, Huizenga moved fast. He stopped franchising almost entirely and began aggressively buying back the franchises Cook had already sold, while simultaneously acquiring rival chains outright. In 1987 alone, Blockbuster bought two competing chains, Southern Video and Movies to Go, instantly gaining footholds in new markets rather than building them store by store. By the end of that year, the company had grown from 35 locations to 133, making it the fifth largest video rental chain in the country. Revenue jumped from $7 million to $43 million in a single year. That was just the beginning. Through 1988 and 1989, Blockbuster was opening a new store, on average, every 17 hours. That's more than one new location every single day, month after month. In 1988, the company acquired another competitor, Video Library Incorporated, adding hundreds more stores, and struck a franchise deal with United Cable to expand even further. By the end of that year, Blockbuster had grown to 415 stores and had rocketed from 5th place to the #1 video rental chain in the country. 3 years earlier, it had been a single store in Dallas. The operation became genuinely industrial in scale. Huizenga's team built a system where they could load a single truck with everything required to open a brand new Blockbuster store, ship it to a new town, and have a freshly hired local crew open the doors within days. And when a local competitor refused to sell, Huizenga used a tactic straight out of his waste management playbook: flood that market with new Blockbuster locations, undercut prices, blanket the area in advertising, and wait for the competitor to either fold or sell. What made this expansion different from a typical retail rollout wasn't just the speed, it was the discipline behind it. Huizenga treated every new market the same way he'd treated garbage routes at Waste Management. Figure out who the strongest local competitor is, and either buy them or bury them. His team would scout a town, identify the dominant independent video store, and make an offer. If the owner said yes, that location got absorbed and rebranded almost overnight. If the owner said no, Huizenga would simply open 2 or 3 Blockbuster stores nearby, undercut prices, run heavier advertising, and wait. Most independent operators didn't have the capital reserves to survive that kind of pressure for long, and within a year or two, they'd either close or come back with a much lower asking price. By 1989, 2 years after Huizenga's investment, Blockbuster had grown to 700 stores. Sales had tripled, profits were up 400%, the stock price had climbed more than sevenfold in the same period, and the growth didn't slow down. By 1990, Blockbuster operated more locations than its next 375 competitors combined. The independent video store, once the only option in most towns, was becoming an endangered species. By 1993, Blockbuster had grown to over 3,400 stores worldwide and controlled roughly a quarter of the entire global video rental market. It was larger than all of its remaining competitors put together. At its peak, the company employed 84,000 people across 26 countries, and it had become one of the most recognizable retail brands in America, right up there with McDonald's and Walmart in terms of sheer physical footprint. A significant piece of that profitability came from something almost every customer who lived through this era remembers, with a mix of nostalgia and irritation: late fees. Return a rental a single day past its due date and you'd be charged a fee that could easily exceed the cost of the rental itself. Customers hated it, but it worked. By the late 1990s, Blockbuster was generating over $800 million a year in profit from late fees alone. For an entire generation, walking through those bright aisles on a Friday night wasn't just an errand, it was the start of the weekend. Families would split up between the new release wall and the older titles further back. Kids would negotiate with parents over which movie made the cut, and the whole ritual ended at a checkout counter where the employee would remind you, again, that the tape needed to be back by a specific time or you'd be paying for it. That friction, the thing people complained about constantly, was also part of what made the brand so recognizable. Nobody forgets the sting of a late fee, and Blockbuster had built an entire empire partly on the back of that irritation. Feeling untouchable, the company started experimenting outside its core business. It dabbled in video game rentals, opened music stores, and even floated the idea of a Blockbuster theme park in Florida. But, underneath the surface, the fundamentals were shifting. The video rental market itself was maturing, and growth was slowing as the market became saturated with Blockbuster's own stores. At the same time, the early internet was starting to hint at a different kind of future, one where movies might not require a physical trip to a store at all. Recognizing that the easiest money might already be behind him, Huizenga made his move. In 1994, after a decade of building the company from a handful of stores into a national juggernaut, he sold the entire Blockbuster chain to media conglomerate Viacom for $8.4 billion in cash and stock. Huizenga personally walked away with roughly $900 million. It was the kind of exit that, in hindsight, looks almost too well timed. Viacom didn't buy Blockbuster because it loved video rental. It bought Blockbuster because it needed leverage. At the time, Viacom was assembling a vertically integrated media empire, combining production studios, television networks, and distribution under one roof, and it had recently taken on significant debt to acquire Paramount Pictures. Blockbuster's massive, reliable cash flow was exactly what Viacom needed to help service that debt, and owning roughly a quarter of the home video rental market also guaranteed strong distribution for whatever Paramount was producing. The problem was that this arrangement meant Viacom had every incentive to treat Blockbuster as a cash cow rather than a business that needed continued reinvestment, right at the moment when the industry was on the edge of major technological change. Investors noticed. By 1996, just 2 years after the acquisition, Blockbuster's value had fallen by more than half. In 1997, Viacom brought in a new CEO to try to turn things around, a man named John Antioco, who had previously run convenience store and fast food chains. His mandate was twofold: get Blockbuster's core rental business humming again and prepare the company for the coming digital shift. Antioco revived the company's classic "Make it a Blockbuster night" marketing campaign, streamlined operations, and cut costs. But his most consequential move was a complete rethinking of how Blockbuster actually acquired its inventory. Under the old model, Blockbuster paid the full wholesale price, often well over $60 per tape, to purchase copies of a new release before renting them out. Antioco went to the major movie studios with a different proposal. Instead of a large upfront payment, Blockbuster would pay a small amount per copy and then share a percentage of the rental revenue with the studio on an ongoing basis. This revenue-sharing model meant Blockbuster could afford to stock 100 copies of a hot new release in a single store, something a small independent competitor could never match with only 3 or 4 copies on hand. It cemented Blockbuster's dominance in exactly the area customers cared about most: actually being able to find the movie they wanted, in stock, the night they wanted it. The strategy worked. In 1998, Blockbuster swung to a profit of $54 million, a dramatic turnaround from a loss of over $300 million the year before. But while Antioco was successfully rearranging operations at the top, the ship itself was still heading directly toward an iceberg most people inside the company hadn't fully clocked yet. In 1997, a small startup called Netflix launched, mailing DVDs directly to customers with no due dates and no late fees. By 2000, the company was burning through cash and looking for a way out. Netflix co-founder and CEO Reed Hastings approached Blockbuster with a proposal. Netflix would essentially become Blockbuster's online arm, and in exchange, Blockbuster would pay $50 million for the business. This is the moment the popular story freezes on. Blockbuster said no, and the assumption ever since has been that this was an act of pure corporate arrogance. A room full of executives, too blind to see what was standing right in front of them. But when you actually look at the situation both companies were in at that moment, the decision looks a lot less foolish. First, Netflix in 2000 was not the Netflix people think of today. It was a small DVD by mail operation, losing money every quarter, with no meaningful competitive moat. Anyone with access to postal distribution centers could theoretically replicate the model. Blockbuster's actual advantage at the time was its physical footprint, thousands of stores in convenient locations across the country, something that took Huizenga a decade and billions of dollars to build, and that a mail-order startup simply could not replicate overnight. Second, remember who Blockbuster answered to. Viacom had bought the company specifically for its steady, reliable cash flow to help service the debt from the Paramount acquisition. Walking into that boardroom and proposing to spend $50 million acquiring a business that was actively losing money in order to intentionally cannibalize Blockbuster's own profitable rental model was never a proposal that had much chance of survival, regardless of who was making it. Third, Netflix wasn't the only threat on the horizon. Redbox, born out of an innovation lab connected to McDonald's, was preparing to blanket the country with kiosks renting DVDs for $1 a night. Blockbuster wasn't staring down a single disruptor it failed to recognize. It was facing a scattering of small, early-stage threats coming from multiple directions at once, none of which looked obviously dominant yet. And fourth, at the exact moment this offer was on the table, Blockbuster was still growing rapidly, on its way to more than 9,000 stores by 2004. When a business is generating that much cash and expanding that fast, It's genuinely difficult, inside the room, in that moment, to justify a dramatic strategic pivot based on a money-losing mail-order company that most people hadn't even heard of yet. None of this means Blockbuster's leadership made the right call. It means the decision wasn't the cartoonish act of stupidity it's usually remembered as. Management wasn't blind to the threat. They saw it. What actually happened next is far more revealing than a single missed acquisition ever could be. Years later, the executive who actually ran Blockbuster during its decline, a man named James Keyes, pushed back publicly on the entire narrative. He didn't dispute that the company failed. He disputed what killed it. In his account, the popular framing of a single missed acquisition became a convenient headline, repeated so often in the years since that it hardened into an accepted fact, even though the reality inside the company at the time was far more complicated than a single yes or no decision in a boardroom. Whether or not you buy his framing entirely, the fact that the man who lived through it still feels the need to correct the record decades later tells you something about how oversimplified the popular version has become. Blockbuster didn't simply ignore the coming disruption. In 2004, the company launched its own DVD by mail service to directly compete with Netflix, and remarkably, it started to work. By 2006 and 2007, Blockbuster had built something Netflix genuinely could not replicate, a program called Total Access, which let customers rent a DVD by mail and then return it to any physical Blockbuster store, immediately receiving a coupon for another free in-store rental. It was a true hybrid of digital convenience and physical retail presence, and it was working. Total Access drove a significant wave of new subscribers, and for a brief window, Blockbuster genuinely had the advantage over Netflix, because it had something Netflix simply couldn't match: thousands of physical locations. For the first time since Netflix launched, Blockbuster had an answer that didn't just copy the startup, it improved on it. A customer could rent something in-store on a Tuesday, mail it back on a Friday, and have a new disc waiting by mail the following week, all while stacking up in-store renter coupons along the way. Analysts at the time noted that Blockbuster's subscriber growth from Total Access was actually outpacing Netflix's own new sign-ups for a stretch, a detail that rarely makes it into the popular retelling of this story, because it complicates the idea that Blockbuster simply never adapted. Then, in 2007, a new CEO named Jim Keyes took over and shut the program down. He felt it was too expensive, cutting too deeply into the profitability Blockbuster still relied on from in-store late fees and rentals. This decision is arguably the single most consequential choice in the entire story, and it's almost never the part people talk about. Blockbuster had built the exact hybrid model that could have neutralized Netflix's core advantage. Then Blockbuster killed it themselves, not because a startup out-innovated them, but because the company was so financially strained by debt that it couldn't afford to invest in its own best idea. That debt traces directly back to how Viacom handled the company's exit. In 2004, recognizing both the coming disruption and Blockbuster's slowing growth, Viacom spun the company off into its own independent entity. But along the way, Viacom saddled Blockbuster with $1.45 billion in debt, structured in a way that let Viacom shareholders receive a special cash payout funded by that very debt. Blockbuster was sent out into the most disruptive period in its industry's history, already carrying a financial anchor that had nothing to do with any decision its own leadership had made. With that debt load in place, Blockbuster tried one more major move to win back customers. In 2005, the company launched a widely publicized "No More Late Fees" campaign, eliminating the fees that had generated hundreds of millions of dollars in profit for years. It backfired almost immediately. The policy was riddled with fine print that customers felt was misleading, and 47 state attorneys general ended up suing Blockbuster over how the program was marketed. Between the DVD by mail push and the elimination of late fees, the company poured over $400 million into initiatives meant to win back customer trust, at precisely the moment it had the least financial room to spare. By the late 2000s, the pressure was coming from every direction at once. Netflix was shifting from DVDs to online streaming. Redbox kiosks were undercutting prices to $1 a night outside grocery stores and pharmacies nationwide. YouTube and early streaming platforms were changing how people thought about watching video at all. Then, in 2008, the financial crisis hit, and consumers pulled back on spending across the board. Blockbuster was left holding thousands of expensive physical leases, while foot traffic and rentals dropped sharply, all while still trying to service well over $1 billion in debt inherited from its own spin-off. In 2010, Blockbuster filed for bankruptcy, carrying over $900 million in debt. What had once been the dominant force in an entire industry was broken up and sold off for scraps, purchased by a satellite television provider for roughly $320 million, a fraction of what Huizenga had sold it for 16 years earlier. By 2014, nearly every store was gone. Today, a single franchise location remains open in Bend, Oregon, kept alive largely as a novelty and a piece of living nostalgia. So if the popular story is wrong, what's the real one? Blockbuster wasn't destroyed by a single missed opportunity to buy a struggling mail-order startup for $50 million. It was built by an aggressive, brilliant operator in Wayne Huizenga, sold at the top of the market to a media conglomerate that needed its cash flow more than its future, saddled with debt during its most critical years of disruption, and then, in its one genuine moment of innovation, had its best idea deliberately shut down because the company could no longer afford to bet on itself. The uncomfortable truth is that Blockbuster's leadership actually built the tool that could have beaten Netflix. Total Access wasn't a hypothetical. It existed, it worked, and customers were signing up for it. The company didn't lose because it failed to see the future. It lost because a decade of financial engineering, first by Viacom's spin-off debt, and later by short-term cost-cutting, left it without the resources to finish the fight it had already started winning. It's a far less comfortable story than the one usually told, because it removes the easy villain. There's no single room of executives laughing off an offer that would have saved them. Instead, there's a chain of ownership decisions, made by different people for different reasons, none of which had much to do with movies at all, that slowly stripped away the one company's ability to survive the industry it had once completely dominated. There's a broader lesson buried in here too, one that goes beyond Blockbuster specifically. When a company gets acquired, the terms of that acquisition can quietly determine its fate years before anyone notices the effects. Huizenga's sale to Viacom in 1994 wasn't a mistake, it was a masterclass in exit timing, cashing out at the absolute peak of the video rental industry's value. But that same sale locked Blockbuster into a decade of decisions made by an owner whose priorities had almost nothing to do with movies. And by the time Viacom spun the company back out in 2004, it did so in a way that extracted one last payday for its own shareholders, while leaving Blockbuster to face the most disruptive years in its industry's history, already deep in debt. Neither Huizenga nor Viacom did anything illegal, or even particularly unusual by the standards of corporate finance. They simply made rational decisions in their own self-interest, and Blockbuster's frontline employees, its customers, and its eventual bankruptcy were the ones left holding the consequences. It's worth sitting with how different this version of the story is from the one that gets repeated at business conferences. The convenient myth turns Blockbuster's collapse into a morality play. Arrogant executives, obvious warning signs, a scrappy underdog that deserved to win. It's satisfying because it has a clear villain and a clean lesson. Don't get complacent, watch out for disruption. But the real story doesn't offer that same comfort, because the people running Blockbuster during its final years weren't complacent at all. They built a genuinely competitive alternative to Netflix. They saw the disruption coming from multiple directions, and they still lost, not from a single bad call, but from years of financial decisions made above their heads, by owners who had already moved on to their next deal long before the consequences arrived. Maybe that's why the simpler version of the story survives. It's easier to believe a company died because its leaders were blind than to accept that sometimes the right decision gets made, the right product gets built, and it still isn't enough, because the walls closing in were put there years earlier by people who were never in the room to answer for it. Blockbuster wasn't beaten by a smarter competitor. It was starved of the resources to finish a fight it had already found a way to win. The next time you hear someone say, "Blockbuster laughed Netflix out of the room," you'll know the real story is a lot more interesting, and honestly, a lot more human. It's not a story about a company that couldn't see the future. It's a story about a company that saw it clearly, built the right answer, and then wasn't allowed to keep it.